It was another week of major elections around the country. We had two upsets in Midwestern states again, more like maybe an upset and a half. We'll get into it. And what those elections mean for both parties, if they mean anything at all, is also something we're going to talk about. Then, a pretty upsetting story is emerging out of the war in Iran as reports of sailors have been trying to jump overboard from one of the Navy's largest aircraft carriers have started to surface, and now it's a brewing standoff between the U.S. Navy and Pete Hegseth. And finally, a new report about Trump's White House construction projects says it's more expensive than we thought, and we're paying for most of it, and now some lawmakers want answers. So much for summer break in D.C., I guess. It's Thursday, August 13th, 2026. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Hermes. Before we get into today's show, this is the final week of the Make It Make Sense anniversary sale for the Make It Make Sense Substack. If you haven't done it yet, you've got just a few days left to lock in the launch price of $5 a month or $50 a year. That gets you access to the entire podcast history, the weekly original reporting, things you forgot from civics class, too long tuned out, and the occasional Make It Make Nonsense, which is basically something in your inbox 6 days a week, if not every single day of the week. Now, that sale runs until August 20th. You can head to makeitmakesense.substack.com or head to the link in the description for this episode to get that deal right now. Okay, let's get back to the show. Tuesday night was another big primary election night. Most of the focus was on two states, Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's been a big primary season for those of us here in the upper Midwest, and frankly, we're a little too nice to be comfortable with this much attention. Anyway, in Wisconsin, the Democratic primary race looked as if the Democratic Socialist candidate, Francesca Hong, would be the nominee. Her closest competitor, David Crowley, who had dropped out of the race in July before jumping back into the race after he got an endorsement from the state's popular governor, Tony Evers, was behind Hong by about 20 points in the polls before Election Day. But instead, Hong ended up losing by less than 0.5%. We are talking about 3,796 votes, which could trigger a recount if Hong wants to pay for it. This race was also heavily watched because after the win of progressive Senate candidate Abdul El-Sayed in Michigan last week, Francesca Hong was an actual DSA candidate, that's Democratic Socialists of America, and would have been the next candidate to win the nomination for a statewide race, but also the first DSA candidate to win for governor, in a primary at least. And as a lot of people have been saying, that specific piece, the Democratic Party becoming serious contenders during this election cycle, has had a lot of people questioning what the future of the Democratic Party will look like. So now, because she lost, there are a lot of establishment Democrats breathing a sigh of relief and have started to tell themselves that the moderate establishment wing of the party is still in control, while at the same time the DSA and progressive Democrats are considering Hong's campaign a moral victory to go along with the slate of other real gains they've made in state and congressional races this year. This race wasn't going to settle that debate no matter which way it shook out, so I wouldn't spend a ton of time trying to read the tea leaves on this. The story that people aren't focusing on as much, which I think is actually the better story out of this race, is the fact that Francesca Hong didn't run a good end of her primary campaign. And good campaigning still matters, whether the polling has you up 20 points or down 20 points. She got in hot water over some previous fringe left-wing tweets and statements that she'd made in the past, like wanting to cancel Thanksgiving, which she said was a part of a series of jokes that she made years ago and only sort of walked the statement back. But the way she handled it lacked a lot of tact, a lot of political manners, I guess you would call it, which isn't to say that she needed to compromise her beliefs, it's just the PR direction wasn't very good. And on top of that, she didn't run a single TV ad. Instead, she ran a door-to-door digital grassroots race, which was a gamble. But also, it meant that the polling her team was doing here wasn't seeing where the voters actually were. Not that the other polls in this race were better, mind you, and I'll talk about that in a second, but when those things were put up against what was a very effective Democratic establishment backing David Crowley, the voting on Election Day was a very different thing from what everyone had predicted. And let's talk about those predictions because, again, the polling here was way off, which is the norm for primaries. The pollster G. Elliott Morris, who really has become one of my go-to polling gurus, he's the brain behind the website Strength in Numbers. He just put out a new look at primary polling as a whole and found that on average, they're about 13 points off. It's because polling for the primaries is hard. You're trying to get a read on a sliver of a sample of a slice of a population because primary voters aren't the same people who vote in the general elections. There are fewer of them, and they're the most engaged voters. They don't always reflect the broader party, and primary voters also tend to be more changeable with who they're voting for, mostly because it's not a binary choice between their party and the other guys. They've just got more people to choose from. And because for pollsters there are so few primary voters, they're hard to get a hold of again. So it's just hard to get a good sense of where folks are. And then there was this hiccup around midnight in this race, too, that you're going to hear about, that we have to talk about. You're going to hear about this either because it's getting folded into a conspiracy or because you've seen clips of Chris Kornacki, the NBC touchscreen guy, having a bit of a crash out on live TV.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
They have to... What were they... Okay.
So what happened that made Kornacki do that was a clerk who had transferred about 5 USB drives with vote data on them realized they had also accidentally added another set of data to that drive too. That could have thrown the ultimate count off. So it meant they had to go back to the precincts where those drives were from and start over. And then put the right numbers back on the drives and take them back to the actual county office and then do the entire thing again. That meant that the results took longer than expected, and the county that happened in was Milwaukee County, where David Crowley is currently the executive, basically the chief administrator of the county. So a ton of people on the right and a few on the left are crying election fraud. There is no evidence of that happening. And if anything, the delay and the fact that the error was caught immediately and changed right away, well, that's probably a tally in the not fraud column. Plus, we don't have any proof that the other layers of security failed, like election tampering or chain of custody. And this race will absolutely be audited as well. And for her part in this, Hong has already said she's going to support Crowley and campaign for Democrats, so it doesn't seem like she's on board with the conspiracy talk either. But speaking of election conspiracies, let's move on to the other race that was worth watching, which was the Republican primary just across the Mississippi River in Minnesota. That was between the current Speaker of the Minnesota State House, Lisa DeMuth, and Mike Lindell, the MyPillow guy turned massive election conspiracy peddler. The polls leading up to this race had Lindell up about 6 points heading into Election Day. Again, primary polls, take that for what you will. Lindell was endorsed by Trump, but DeMuth had also made a big name for herself late last year and earlier this year by being the person responsible for bringing the YouTuber Nick Shirley to Minnesota, where he pretended to uncover fraud, and that hysteria eventually led to the massive DHS deployment that then killed 2 U.S. citizens at the hands of ICE agents. But on election night, DeMuth, who again was down 6 points, won by almost 13. And Lindell has now refused to concede this race and has said the race was fraudulent. Here is a short clip of that.
And we got 6,000. It just, the decline that Lisa was in doesn't make sense. It went like this. So we're going to look at that, and we'll let you know in the next few days what's going to happen. I'm not going to sit by until these numbers are explained. Someone's going to have to explain to me why.
I have to be very careful with how much time I spend listening to Lindell, not because I think he's going to make some good points or anything like that, because if I'm not careful, you betcha I'll slip right into my hometown accent, don't you know? I can't believe I did that. Anyway, again, there's no proof of any kind of fraud happening, and there will be audits done of this race as well. And much like the Abdul El Sayed conspiracy here, there's also a conspiracy going around in Minnesota that a bunch of Democrats crossed the aisle to vote in the state's open primary to vote against Lindell. But that doesn't make sense because DeMuth was a stronger candidate. She's only trailing Democratic nominee Senator Amy Klobuchar by 8 points, and Lindell was losing by 13. So why would they vote against a weaker candidate? That doesn't hold up. But that aside, this does have some people continuing to ask the question whether Trump is losing his grip on the Republican Party. I think that's hard to tell from one race, and other races like Kentucky or Texas or North Carolina, where the president was able to successfully oust popular sitting members of the House or the Senate, are better measures of his strength in the party among some voters. And if anything, Mike Lindell is a crackpot who makes most Minnesotans recoil, which in Midwestern speak is to politely decline passive-aggressively. Either way, I don't think it's a real reflection of where Trump is, but rather where Lindell is. And all of this is to say the real test of where the parties are heading and who's got control and who doesn't will be the midterms, which is where those things were always going to get decided. Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, sailors jumping overboard in the Arabian Sea and Trump trying to pull a fast one over on the American taxpayer on the White House grounds. I've found something that I need to stay sane in all this chaos is going to the gym. I go to the Kronk gym here in Detroit. If you're into boxing, that might mean something to you. If not, it's really just an excuse to hit something and, to get a workout in. But I also like to drink a protein shake afterwards to make sure that I'm staying healthy. I have spent years suffering through the worst kinds of protein shakes. Chalky, thick, it's like drinking wet cement. It's just awful. It's honestly worse than the workout. It's why I recently switched to Clear Protein. That's Clear with a K. It's a clear whey protein. They've got 2 great flavors right now, strawberry watermelon and wild blue raspberry. This stuff tastes like a juice drink instead of a milkshake gone wrong, you know what I mean? And it's not skimping to get there either. 20 grams of protein, no sugar, no lactose, so no bloat, and no tummy troubles if that's a problem for you, and you already know that's a deal breaker. If this sounds like something that you want after your workout, you can get your hands on a 20% off code right now. You can use MIMS25 at checkout. And full disclosure, I do get a cut of this commission, but you'll be helping out the show too and getting some great tasting protein for after your workout. Again, that's Clear Protein with a K. Use MIMS25 at checkout because drinking your protein shake shouldn't be the hardest part of your workout. All right, let's get back to the show. So on Wednesday this week, we got some, frankly, really upsetting reporting about the well-being of sailors aboard several Navy ships, but mainly the USS Abraham Lincoln. Families of service members aboard the aircraft carrier have said multiple sailors have needed to be restrained after attempting to jump overboard. And last month, families of the nearly 5,000-member crew of the Lincoln held a town hall with the Navy secretary to talk about serious issues on board, like the declining state of mental health and morale, the lack of communication with their loved ones, packages and mail being lost for weeks, which calls into question whether many of these service members were able to vote in time, let alone receive updates and care packages from home. And then there have been dozens of the photos of the lack of rations on board. Service members being served meals that were a quarter cup of pulled pork and 2 tortillas, or a slice of ham and dry pasta, or at worst, a half cup of carrots and some kind of gray mystery thing that looks like what happened when you mixed all the colors of Play-Doh together. And on top of that, there have been reports of mold on board ships because they haven't been able to be properly cleaned. Deck safety issues because repairs that are made only when docked have not been made. Broken toilets and laundry, and a shortage of hygiene products and water. The Abraham Lincoln has been deployed for 250 days and has not been in port for 200 days. It's not what the USS Gerald Ford did, which was 326 days of deployment, but the difference is the Lincoln hasn't made port almost the entire time. That usually happens every 30 to 45 days so they can resupply with things like fresh food and fresh water and get real rest for Marines and sailors on board that ship, as well as make sure that the ship is in good working order. But because the war in Iran has dragged out for so long, that is not happening. And it's becoming incredibly dangerous for these service members. These men and women who are trained to be at sea for extended periods of time, they know what they signed up for. And they also know that attempting to go overboard is a crime in the military, and it could be considered a crime called malingering, which is to harm yourself to get out of service. It could be considered harming yourself without the intention to get out of service, or it could be considered desertion, all of which are considered worse than going AWOL under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. When Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was asked about rations aboard U.S. ships, that had been deployed for months on end, he told members of Congress and the Senate and the press that our service men and women were being taken care of. Today, when he was asked about what family members were being told about their loved ones, by their loved ones, and what they were going through, he said this.
Completely misrepresented. Listen, we make sure that every ship, every crew, every captain has everything we can provide them at every single moment. Some deployments are longer than others, and I have more respect and gratitude for those sailors than anybody. What they do in those high seas and those austere conditions with less port calls, it's incredible. I mean, Americans don't understand what it's like to do that. So as someone who's not been on a ship like that, but been on long deployments, I feel it.
So, yeah, that's a lot of kind of mush there, right? But also, what Hegseth is doing is essentially chalking up the reporting and the testimony from families to a misunderstanding at best, and at worst, lies, which is really something coming from a guy who says he always backs the troops. Now, the Pentagon is scrambling the USS Teddy Roosevelt aircraft carrier to steam to the Middle East to relieve the Abraham Lincoln, but checking this morning, the TR was still docked in San Diego, and at full speed, it'll take 3 weeks for it to reach where the Lincoln is, meaning the Lincoln is looking at 6 weeks before they reach U.S. soil again, assuming they don't make port somewhere in Southeast Asia. This kind of strain isn't just happening on the Lincoln. It's just these stories are the most alarming. This kind of morale dip, the deployment toll, and frankly logistical failure from the Pentagon is happening to troops all over this war across branches of the military. This exact thing is the reason so many national security experts and former military leaders were against Hegseth being nominated to be secretary because he didn't have an understanding of what it meant to run a department the size of the DoD, and that it really isn't about DEI or vaccines or whether our troops have enough testosterone, but it's about can we make sure the military runs smoothly enough? This kind of thing. Do they have the supplies to be ready to fight in a war? Now, this entire thing is obviously a ticking time bomb, and it further complicates Trump's desperation to get out of Iran. But also senators are now demanding answers from Hegseth and the Navy Secretary. In a letter from Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal, he's demanding answers about who authorized the Lincoln to not resupply for the last 200 days, what the Navy's plan when it came to repeatedly extending sailors' deployment in Iran was, and what's the Pentagon plan now, going forward, regardless of whether the Lincoln returns home or not. Blumenthal sits on the Homeland Security and Armed Services Committees and is the highest-ranking Democrat on the Veterans Affairs Committee. He is not someone that the Pentagon can just ignore without real problems, especially when the defense budget is on the line when the House and Senate come back from summer recess. So that story is going to continue to play out for the next few weeks, which is where we're going to leave it and switch to our last story here today. The White House construction plan is more expensive than we've been led to believe, and it's likely that we are paying for it and we didn't know. The Washington Post got a hold of some confidential contracts and found that the president's construction projects are set to cost around $927 million. And in order to sidestep the normal need for congressional approval, the money has been put into a White House maintenance fund that usually is given around $2.5 million. The projects don't just include the ballroom/bunker/hospital/drone port/what I assume is now the wardrobe to Narnia at this point that the president is building where the East Wing used to be. It also includes the paving over of the Rose Garden, repaired fountains in Lafayette Park, a new presidential helipad, and a new visitor screening center with its own underground bunker portion. All told, the Post says it would be the most expensive set of changes to the White House in 80 years. More than $500 million of that funding is coming at the expense of taxpayers. Back in June, the House and Senate passed a $415 million budget to be used for the Secret Service. Most of that was taken from the people tasked with protecting the president and our nation's leaders past and present and put directly into this construction fund. The rest of the 85 or so million was taken from the White House military office. There was another about $305 million that came from private donations, and another $70 million or so was unaccounted for. The rest of the money had already been found and spent, but almost none of this has been put all in one place until now. And it is staggering to see both the sheer amount of that money itself, but also the lies that we were told that the taxpayer wouldn't be paying for most of these things. Then there's also the question of kickbacks and grift. Former Labor Secretary and economist Robert Reich said on social media, remember that big corporations are also chipping in, and some have since received government contracts or had federal regulatory actions against them dropped. Everything is for sale. And you can go back and listen to several of my interviews with the folks from Public Citizen about this exact thing. And apparently everything for sale means the White House grounds. The reporting comes less than a week after a federal appeals court in D.C. told Trump that his ballroom is illegal and he cannot keep building it. What they said was each president is a temporary tenant, not the owner of the White House. The president has no, and claims no, constitutionally assigned authority over that property, which is true to the intention of Congress and the White House when they decided to make D.C. the capital in 1790. The president is also planning to appeal this to the Supreme Court to stop this ruling from going into effect, and that will likely end up on the shadow docket, which I've talked about before, but it's where Trump has had a lot of success with quick, easy, cheap decisions from the justices, especially during the summer. But like I've said before on this show and online, the White House construction projects are less, I think, about what specifically Trump is doing to the White House or its grounds, though that does matter. We care about this because it's the people's house. And even if you don't have an emotional connection to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue itself, the building or whatever, the idea that Trump treats the presidency like something to be owned, traded, and sold does impact a lot of Americans. It strikes a chord for a lot of us. I think that's why so many people are so upset by this story. It's not the money. It's the symbol of the thing being altered in a way that we didn't ask for or approve of. In response to this new reporting, some high-ranking Democrats like Chuck Schumer and Jeff Merkley have sent a letter to the Government Accountability Office to get them to dig into these construction projects and find some answers. That could take months. The order blocking the construction on the ballroom, that doesn't go into effect for another week, so things will continue as, I guess, unusual at the White House until then, or until the Supreme Court steps in and says otherwise. Like I said, so much for a slow start to summer break in D.C. All right, that is it for today's show. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. You have just about a week or so, actually exactly a week, to become a paid subscriber at the launch price of $5 a month or $50 for the entire year. That price ends on August 20th before it goes up to $7 for new subscribers. And as always, you can share the show on social media. You can tag me at Grant Hermes on Twitter, Blue Sky, and the Say So News app, and at Grant_Hermes on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Hermes, and I'll talk to you next time.